The next talk is by Sean McMahon, and he will talk about microbial contributions to underwater cracks. There you go.
Hello everyone, it's very nice to be here. Thanks very much for having me along. I've really enjoyed the talk so far. I'm going to be talking about subaqueously formed sedimentary cracks and the evidence for a possible microbial contribution to the formation of some of them. Now, of course, we're all familiar with desiccation cracks, which are obviously formed by the desiccation of sediment that's subaerially exposed. They're about the most recognizable sedimentary structure you could possibly wish for. Very, very common in both modern sediments and in the rock record, very easy to interpret. But there are also cracks in the sedimentary rock record that appear to have formed either at or below the sediment-water interface in strictly subaqueous settings without subaerial exposure. And those cracks are more difficult to interpret and a bit controversial and very diverse, and there may be many different phenomena involved. And in some cases, people have suggested a microbial contribution to their formation. So in this talk, mostly I'll review these cracks based on what's in the literature. I'll discuss the mechanisms that have been proposed to explain them, and then I'll focus on how microbes might be involved and show you some of our own sort of modest experimental work that points in that direction. So the first thing to say is that cracking of sediments underwater or below the sediment-water interface hasn't been widely observed in the modern. There are very few instances where this has been observed. One of them is shown on the left. This was just published last year. You're looking down on a mud flat there. This is just under a few centimeters of water, and there's a gentle wave action which appears to be opening these little cracks at the sediment-water interface there. But there are lots of examples in the rock record of cracks which appear to have formed in strictly subaqueous settings. And in some cases, the evidence for that is unequivocal, certainly not in all cases. But here I've shown you, for instance, on the top left, some cracks radiating from a marine burrow in a Triassic marine facies, and on the top right, cracks on the base of a hummocky cross-stratified sandstone. There are marine fossils on the same bedding plane. These are definitely marine rocks. And there's also pretty clear evidence that cracks can open not just at, but below the sediment-water interface. So that, for example, instead of tapering downwards in the way that desiccation cracks do, they might taper at top and bottom and form this kind of spindle shape that you're seeing in the bottom left in the Neoproterozoic of Spitsbergen. And in this one unusual case that I know of, a crack has opened up in a mud layer below and after the deposition of this overlying sand, so that the sand has subsided into it. So clearly this crack here formed below the sediment-water interface. Now, these are very diverse features. They are by no means reducible to a simple description in the way that desiccation cracks are. They adopt a very wide range of morphologies, scales, lithologies, both in terms of the host sediment and the infilling material, which can be a cement or it can be clastic, and in the facies in which they occur, and they are found throughout the history of the Earth. There's these so-called Manchuria ficus type sinuous cracks in ripple troughs, which is fairly common in pre-Mesozoic sandstones. There are more branching or polygonal forms, such as these from the Ordovician beach formation of Newfoundland. These ones do taper downwards, and some of them also bifurcate. You can see there in cross-section. A well-known example is in the Orcadian Basin of northeast Scotland, which is one of the places they were first described as having formed subaqueously. This is a lacustrine setting, of course. Here's a Jurassic sandy marine limestone with calcite-filled cracks in it. And finally, here's an example that was described recently from Mars, where there are apparently very similar-looking cracks to these, cemented by an unknown mineral in a lacustrine mudstone. This is in Gusev crater, nearly 4 billion years old. And just to emphasize, they don't only occur in siliciclastic sediments either. There are lots of examples in carbonates. Of course, septarian nodules will be familiar to everybody, as containing subaqueously formed cracks below the sediment-water interface, but there are also examples from bedded carbonates with very low or no clay content, although that particular example does have some clay in it, which look a bit like desiccation cracks, but are demonstrably not. And then there's this whole class of features called molar tooth structures, which some of you will know about, which are a bit sort of crack-like in their morphology. Here in vertical cross-section, you can see they tend to be very elongate, commonly tematically folded. But on bedding planes, they look rather like desiccation cracks, except they're always filled with calcite spar. These are very common in Proterozoic carbonates and Archean carbonates. So how can you form cracks in sediments underwater? I think it's a two-part problem. The first part is the sediment needs to be cohesive. Sand grains will, of course, just flow. Silt will just flow. Clay has a certain amount of cohesiveness because of the attraction between clay particles. But many sediments simply will not behave in a brittle way unless there is something extra that's binding them together. And the second part of it is you need some initiating stress to actually initiate cracks, whether that be related to expansion or shrinkage or compression or shear or the disruptive effect of gases. All of these have been invoked in particular sets of cracks in the rock record. So I think, given that there must be many different ways of making sediments cohesive and of applying stresses to them underwater, we shouldn't expect there to be a single universal explanation for subaqueously formed cracks in the way that there is for desiccation cracks. Now, to go over the main mechanisms that have been discussed in the past, probably the most famous is salinity-related synaeresis. So synaeresis is a general term for the expulsion of water from contracting gels. And in this context, it refers to the loss of interlayer water from smectites when you increase the salinity around them. It's very easy to demonstrate in the laboratory, as was done, for example, by Donovan and Foster in 1972, that you can produce cracks in smectites simply by increasing the salinity of the water in which you have deposited them. In this case, at the sediment-water interface, in these examples from my lab, below the sediment-water interface. So it's a readily demonstrable mechanism which might apply in environments where you have fluctuating salinity and smectite clays. But that is not an accurate description of many of the fascies in which we find subaqueously formed sedimentary cracks. So this is not a universally applicable explanation. A lot of attention is also focused on mechanical processes, be they compaction, which can increase cohesion, expel water, and cause shrinkage, and also just mechanically break cohesive layers, or loading, wave action, or seismic disturbance. So there are rare examples of cracks that appear to be related to load structures. I showed you this example before of a modern subaqueously formed set of cracks driven by wave action. And there are, particularly in Cambrian ribbon carbonates, where you can see that the carbonate beds have cracked in a brittle way and been displaced a little bit like little normal faults, while the less cohesive, less carbonate cemented mud around them has simply flowed. So you have cracks forming below the sediment-water interface concentrated in these carbonate beds. And in plan view, they do look a bit like polygonal desiccation cracks in some cases. Oh, but I forgot to say, again, this is a model that only works in certain settings. And compaction alone surely is not sufficient an explanation for the majority of these cracks. Otherwise, they'd be much more common than they are. Compaction happens to all sediments. So how might microbes be involved? Well, the reason I set things up this way is because I think they might be involved both in cohesion and in the stress responsible for creating subaqueous cracks, at least in some cases. So it's been suggested that microbes, well, we all know that microbes improve the cohesion of sediments with their EPS and their biofilms, making the particles stick together. This might make the microbially biostabilized layers themselves more prone to cracking, in particular more prone to cracking than the layers above and below them, so that when the sediment pile undergoes compaction, the surrounding layers might flow while the stabilized layers might break. Also, it's been suggested that mats might seal the sediment pile at the top so that they sort of fix the top of a mud layer, so that when compaction occurs, the mud underneath is forced to crack since it's fixed at the top. Gas-related dewatering might also improve the cohesion of microbially sort of fertile muds. And of course, microbially mediated cementation might improve the cohesion of microbially fertile sediments. And then the main way that microbes can disrupt sediments and apply stress to them is by producing gas, which they will do copiously. And perhaps also by trapping gas along the underside of mat layers. And then there might be also shrinkage of organic-rich sediments as the organic matter is decayed. So these are ways in which microbial activity can apply stress to sediment. So there's some geological evidence for associations between subaqueously formed cracks and microbial activity. And the most sort of compelling example probably is of Manchuria ficus type cracks in relatively coarse sediments, in sandstones, where you would expect the grains simply to flow unless they were bound together by something. And the best candidate, especially given that these cracks are often associated with microbially induced sedimentary structures, is microbial mats. And there's at least one case where, in cross-section, you can see the remains of these mats and you can see how they've been disrupted by the formation of these cracks. So in these cases, it might be that the mats are providing the cohesion that's essential to cracking. There's also, just in this paper from a few years ago by Dario Harazim and colleagues, evidence for a microbial contribution to the formation of these cracks in a mudstone in a marine heterolytic succession from the Ordovician of Newfoundland. In this case, there's an increase in organic carbon content, and there's a pronounced excursion in the carbon isotope composition of that organic carbon, just in the layers where these cracks appear. So it might be, again, that this was a particularly microbially biostabilized layer, which is cracked here. And then when it comes to gas production, we do have a little bit of evidence from modern sediments. What you're seeing here is an X-ray image from about 35 centimeters below the Baltic seafloor, showing that these gas voids have a surprisingly crack-like morphology. They have two long dimensions and one short one, so they're roughly planar, and they're oriented like this, as cracks would be, and they branch a little bit. And I compare them to these cracks in the Orcadian Basin. That the same scale bar here applies to both images. They look pretty similar to me. So it's possible that some of the things that are described as cracks actually started out as gas voids. And the same has been suggested of molar tooth structures. So there's a well-known paper by Furness and colleagues describing how the ribbon and blob-shaped voids that are left behind in molar tooth structures when you dissolve out the calcite look just like the voids created by respiring yeast, the CO2 that they produce in plaster of Paris. So this was their analogue system. Morphologically, the results are very similar to molar tooth structures. So we did some fairly simple experiments. We were interested in all of the various processes that have been suggested to form subaqueous sedimentary cracks. This was fairly simple. We took some relevant substrates, different clay minerals, smectites, different types of mud, and we subjected them to vibration to simulate the effects of seismic activity, loading with different weights, increasing the salinity around them, and just not doing anything at all to them. And for the most part, nothing happened in these experiments. We were able to show, of course, that salinity increase causes smectite to crack, but that's hardly novel. But some interesting things did happen involving microbes. So one of our substrates was a microbial mat that we collected from a tidal salt marsh in Connecticut, which was already a bit sort of cracked in its natural environment, but that might just be the result of occasional desiccation. And you can see here the different coloured layers inside the mat. We collected not just the mat itself, but sort of plugs of the microbially very productive, very black mud from just underneath it. And we slotted these plugs of mud with mats on the top into some of our experimental vessels and applied these various treatments to them. And in all cases, including the control in which we didn't do anything, these mats and the mud produced a huge amount of gas. And that gas bubbled up through the mud and left behind these sorts of snaking voids, sometimes a little bit planar, sometimes hairline cracks opened up between these snaking voids. And this activity occurred across all the experimental conditions. But it did seem that applying weight to the top promoted the production of these gas voids and seemed to favour more vertical or subvertical orientations than in the other experimental conditions. And where these voids connected with the sand layer that we piled on top in some of the experiments, the sand would just passively fill them in and create structures that might be analogous to some of the things that are described as sedimentary cracks in the rock record. Vibration, by the way, didn't do very much except cause density inversion. It did open some sort of lateral voids, but nothing that really looked very crack-like. And salinity didn't seem to do anything in particular to the mat. But then, just serendipitously, a jar of kaolinite that was standing around in the lab turned out to be contaminated with cyanobacteria. So I'm not taking any credit here for this discovery. It's really the bacteria that did it. These cyanobacteria formed a mat at the sediment-water interface. You could peel it away with a pair of tweezers. It was very strong, and it cracked. I think probably because of the degradation of the EPS, which you could see under the microscope, was clearly holding these grains together around these anabina-like filaments. I replicated that with a sterile control, no cracks. So in conclusion, subaqueous sedimentary cracks have many causes. They're polygenetic, to steal a term from Neil Davies. Some of them probably reflect microbial activity. Microbes can provide both the cohesion and the disruptive stress. We observe mat-related subaqueous cracking in the lab, but partly serendipitously, but clearly more experimental and field work is needed. I'll leave this question on the screen for you to consider. That's the end.
one question.
Just curious, in recent sediments, is there any interaction between macrofauna, etc., things that might live in the sediments and their crack formation?
I'm aware of a couple of examples in the rock record of there being burrows that seem to have cracks radiating from them. I think I forgot to mention this, but one of the two definitively marine examples that I showed early on had a burrow right in the middle of it, a marine burrow. I'm not aware of there being any association like that observed in modern sediments, but then there hasn't been very much observation of cracks in modern sediments in general.
Yeah, but I was just thinking if the generation of the crack is to do with gas accumulation and you have a burrow, then you have a mechanism for releasing that pressure.
Yeah.
So you might get through it.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you very much, Sean. Thank you.